Hey all, this is Captain Blood, Chapter 4, Human Merchandise. Mr. Pollexfen was at one and the same time right and wrong, a condition much more common than is generally supposed. He was right in his indifferently expressed thought that a man whose mien and words could daunt such a lord of terror as Jeffreys should by the dominance of his nature be able to fashion himself a considerable destiny. He was wrong, though justifiably so, in his assumption that Peter Blood must hang. I have said that the tribulations with which he was visited as a result of his errand of mercy to Oglethorpe's farm contained, although as he yet did not perceive it, perhaps, two sources of thankfulness: one, that he was tried at all; the other, that his trial took place on the 19th of September. Until the 18th, the sentences passed by the court of the Lords Commissioners had been carried out literally and expeditiously. But on the morning of the 19th there arrived at Taunton a courier from Lord Sunderland, the Secretary of State, with a letter for Lord Jeffreys, wherein he was informed that his Majesty had been graciously pleased to command that 1100 rebels should be furnished for transportation to some of his Majesty's southern plantations, Jamaica, Barbados, or any of the Leeward Islands. You are not to suppose that this command was dictated by any sense of mercy. Lord Churchill was no more than just when he spoke of the King's heart as being as insensible as marble. It had been realized that in these wholesale hangings there was taking place a reckless waste of valuable material. Slaves were urgently required in the plantations, and a healthy, vigorous man could be reckoned worth at least from 10 to 15 pounds. Then there were at court many gentlemen who had some claim or other upon his Majesty's bounty. Here was a cheap and ready way to discharge these claims. From amongst the convicted rebels a certain number might be set aside to be bestowed upon these gentlemen, so that they might dispose of them to their own profit. My Lord Sunderland's letter gives precise details of the royal munificence in human flesh. 1,000 prisoners were to be distributed among some 8 courtiers and others, whilst a postscriptum to his lordship's letter asked for a further 100 to be held at the disposal of the Queen. These prisoners were to be transported at once to his Majesty's southern plantations, and to be kept there for the space of 10 years before being restored to liberty, the parties to whom they were assigned entering into security to see that transportation was immediately effected. We know from Lord Jeffreys' secretary how the Chief Justice inveighed that night in drunken frenzy against this misplaced clemency to which his Majesty had been persuaded. We know how he attempted by letter to induce the King to reconsider his decision. But James adhered to it. It was, apart from the indirect profit he derived from it, a clemency full worthy of him. He knew that to spare lives in this fashion was to convert them into living deaths. Many must succumb in torment to the horrors of West Indian slavery, and so be the envy of their surviving companions. Thus it happened that Peter Blood, and with him Jeremy Pitt and Andrew Baynes, instead of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, as their sentences directed, were conveyed to Bristol, and there shipped with some 50 others aboard the Jamaica Merchant. From close confinement under hatches, ill nourishment, and foul water, a sickness broke out amongst them, of which 11 died. Amongst these was the unfortunate yeoman from Oglethorpe's farm, brutally torn from his quiet homestead amid the fragrant cider orchards, for no other sin than that he had practised mercy. The mortality might have been higher than it was but for Peter Blood. At first the master of the Jamaica Merchant had answered with oaths and threats the doctor's expostulations against permitting men to perish in this fashion, and his insistence that he should be made free of the medicine chest and given leave to minister to the sick. But presently Captain Gardner came to see that he might be brought to task for those too heavy losses of human merchandise, and because of this he was belatedly glad to avail himself of the skill of Peter Blood. The doctor went to work zealously and zestfully, and wrought so ably that by his ministrations and by improving the condition of his fellow captives, he checked the spread of the disease. Towards the middle of December, the Jamaica Merchant dropped anchor in Carlisle Bay, and put ashore the 42 surviving rebels convict. If these unfortunates had imagined, as many of them appear to have done, that they were coming into some wild, savage country, the prospect, of which they had a glimpse before they were hustled over the ship's side into the waiting boats, was enough to correct the impression. They beheld a town of sufficiently imposing proportions, composed of houses built upon European notions of architecture, but without any of the huddle usual in European cities. The spire of a church rose dominantly above the red roofs. A fort guarded the entrance of the wide harbor, with guns thrusting their muzzles between the crenels, and the wide facade of Government House revealed itself dominantly placed on a gentle hill above the town. This hill was vividly green as is an English hill in April, and the day was such a day as April gives to England, the season of heavy rains being newly ended. On a wide cobbled space on the sea front they found a guard of red-coated militia drawn up to receive them, and a crowd, attracted by their arrival, which in dress and manner differed little from a crowd in a seaport at home, save that it contained fewer women and a greater number of negroes. To inspect them, drawn up there on the mole, came Governor Steed, a short, stout, red-faced gentleman, in blue taffetas, burdened by a prodigious amount of gold lace, who limped a little and leaned heavily upon a stout ebony cane. After him, in the uniform of a colonel of the Barbados militia, rolled a tall, corpulent man who towered head and shoulders above the governor, with malevolence plainly written on his enormous yellowish countenance. At his side, and contrasting oddly with his grossness, moving with an easy stripling grace, came a slight young lady in a modish riding gown. The broad brim of a grey hat, with a scarlet sweep of ostrich plume, shaded an oval face upon which the climates of the Tropic of Cancer had made no impression, so delicately fair was its complexion. Ringlets of red-brown hair hung to her shoulders. Frankness looked out from her hazel eyes, which were set wide. Commiserations repressed now the mischievousness that normally inhabited her fresh young mouth. Peter Blood caught himself staring in a sort of amazement at the piquant face, which seemed here so out of place, and finding his stare returned, he shifted uncomfortably. He grew conscious of the sorry figure that he cut. Unwashed, with rank and matted hair, and a disfiguring suit of black camlet in which he had been taken prisoner, now reduced to rags that would have disgraced a scarecrow, he was in no case for inspection by such dainty eyes as these. Nevertheless, they continued to inspect him with round-eyed, almost childlike wonder and pity. Their owner put forth a hand to touch the scarlet sleeve of her companion, whereupon, with an ill-tempered grunt, the man swung his great bulk around so that he directly confronted her. Looking up into his face, she was speaking to him earnestly, but the colonel plainly gave her no more than half his attention. His little beady eyes, closely flanked by a fleshly, pendulous nose, had passed from her, and were fixed upon fair-haired, sturdy young Pitt, who was standing beside Blood. The governor had also come to a halt, and for a moment now that the little group of three stood in convention. What the lady said, Peter could not hear at all, for she lowered her voice. The colonel's reached him in a confused rumble, but the governor was neither considerate nor indistinct. He had a high-pitched voice which carried far, and believing himself witty, he desired to be heard by all. "But, my dear Colonel Bishop, it is for you to take first choice from this dainty nosegay, and at your own price. After that, we'll send the rest to auction." Colonel Bishop nodded his acknowledgment. He raised his voice in answering. "Your Excellency is very good, but faith, they're a weedy lot, not likely to be of much value in the plantation." His beady eyes scanned them again, and his contempt of them deepened the malevolence of his face. It was as if he were annoyed with them for being in no better condition. Then he beckoned forward Captain Gardner, the master of the Jamaica Merchant, and for some minutes stood in talk with him over a list which the latter produced at his request. Presently he waved aside the list, and advanced alone towards the rebels' convict, his eyes considering them, his lips pursed. Before the young Somersetshire shipmaster he came to a halt, and stood an instant pondering him. Then he fingered the muscles of the young man's arm, and bade him open his mouth that he might see his teeth. He pursed his coarse lips again, and nodded. He spoke to Gardner over his shoulder. £15 for this one." The captain made a face of dismay. £15? It isn't half what I meant to ask for him." "It is double what I meant to give," grunted the colonel. "But he would be cheap at £30, your honor." "I can get a negro for that. These white swine don't live. They're not fit for the labor." Gardner broke into protestations of Pitt's health, youth, and vigor. It was not a man he was discussing. It was a beast of burden. Pitt, a sensitive lad, stood mute and unmoving. Only the ebb and flow of color in his cheeks showed the inward struggle by which he maintained his self-control. Peter Blood was nauseated by the loathsome haggle. In the background, moving slowly away down the line of prisoners, went the lady in conversation with the governor, who smirked and preened himself as he limped beside her. She was unconscious of the loathly business the colonel was transacting. Was she, wondered Blood, indifferent to it? Colonel Bishop swung on his heel to pass on. "I'll go as far as £20, not a penny more, and it's twice as much as you're likely to get from Crabston." Captain Gardner, recognizing the finality of the tone, sighed and yielded. Already Bishop was moving down the line. For Mr. Blood, as for a weedy youth on his left, the colonel had no more than a glance of contempt. But the next man, a middle-aged colossus named Wolverstone, who had lost an eye at Sedgemoor, drew his regard, and the haggling was recommenced. Peter Blood stood there in the brilliant sunshine and inhaled the fragrant air, which was unlike any air that he had ever breathed. It was laden with a strange perfume, a blend of logwood, flower, pimento, and aromatic cedars. He lost himself in unprofitable speculation born of that singular fragrance. He was in no mood for conversation, nor was Pitt, who stood dumbly at his side, and who was afflicted mainly at the moment by the thought that he was at last about to be separated from this man with whom he had stood shoulder to shoulder throughout all these troublous months, and whom he had come to love and depend upon for guidance and sustenance. A sense of loneliness and misery pervaded him by contrast with which all that he had endured seemed as nothing. To Pitt, this separation was the poignant climax of all his sufferings. Other buyers came and stared at them, and passed on. Blood did not heed them. And then at the end of the line there was a movement. Gardner was speaking in a loud voice, making an announcement to the general public of buyers that had waited until Colonel Bishop had taken his choice of that human merchandise. As he finished, Blood, looking in his direction, noticed that the girl was speaking to Bishop, and pointing up the line with a silver-hilted riding-whip she carried. Bishop shaded his eyes with his hands to look in the direction in which she was pointing. Then slowly, with his ponderous rolling gait, he approached again, accompanied by the gardener, and followed by the lady and the governor. On they came, till the colonel was abreast of Blood. He would have passed on, but the lady tapped his arm with her whip. "But this is the man I meant," she said. "This one?" Contempt rang in the voice. Peter Blood found himself staring into a pair of beady brown eyes sunk into a yellow, fleshly face, like currants into a dumpling. He felt the color creeping into his face under the insults of that contemptuous inspection. "Bah! A bag of bones! What should I do with him?" He was turning away when Gardner interposed. "He may be lean, but he's tough and healthy. When half of them was sick, and the other half sickening, this rogue kept his legs and doctored his fellows. But for them, there'd have been more deaths than there was. Say £15 for him, Colonel. That's cheap enough. He's tough, I tell your honor, tough and strong, though he be lean, and he's just the man to bear the heat when it comes. The climate will never kill him." There came a chuckle from Governor Steed. "You hear, Colonel? Trust your niece. Her sex knows a man when it sees one." And he laughed, well pleased with his wit. But he laughed alone. A cloud of annoyance swept across the face of the colonel's niece, whilst the colonel himself was too absorbed in the consideration of this bargain to heed the governor's humor. He twisted his lip a little, stroking his chin with his hand the while. Jeremy Pitt had almost ceased to breathe. "I'll give you £10 for him," said the colonel at last. Peter Blood prayed that the offer might be rejected. For no reason that he could have given you, he was taken with repugnance at the thought of becoming the property of this gross animal, and in some sort the property of that hazel-eyed young girl. But it would need more than repugnance to save him from his destiny. A slave is a slave, and has no power to shape his fate. Peter Blood was sold to Colonel Bishop, a disdainful buyer, for the ignominious sum of £10. And thus ends Chapter 4. I love you all. Have a good night.